The masses are never hungry for truth. They shy away from facts that conflict with their preferences, choosing instead to idolize falsehood if it captivates them. Whoever provides them with illusions quickly becomes their master. Anyone who dares to shatter those illusions inevitably becomes their victim. Gustave Le Bon. This powerful quote is not merely a psychological observation, it is a warning, a mirror reflecting our current reality. In times of collective hysteria, what captivates often outweighs what is true, and those who dare to voice the obvious are frequently seen as threats. Have you ever felt like the world has gone mad? That once rational individuals are now defending irrational beliefs with almost religious zeal? That reality feels warped, and the absurd has become the new normal? That sensation isn't paranoia. It's a sign of something much deeper, mass psychosis. Throughout history, entire civilizations have fallen into collective madness, not due to physical weakness, but through structured psychological collapse. And it always begins the same way, with fear, confusion, and silence. But what if I told you that the gravest threat to civilization doesn't come from outside, but from within the human mind? This is the path we're about to explore. And by the end, one question will be unavoidable. Are you still in control of your own mind? What if humanity's greatest enemy wasn't external, but buried within its own psyche? What does mass psychosis picture an entire society drifting away from reality? Not because of a biological outbreak, but due to a psychological collapse. Ordinary people begin to behave irrationally, embracing beliefs detached from logic, science, and lived experience. This is the landscape of mass psychosis, a phenomenon that, contrary to popular belief, is not a fabrication of fiction. Mass psychosis is a kind of mental contagion where delusion spreads like a viral outbreak, engulfing large groups of people. It's not about individual mental diagnoses, but a societal condition in which madness becomes the norm and reason the outlier. Carl Gustav Jung, the famed Swiss psychiatrist, passionately warned of this danger. In his book, The Symbolic Life, he states, "It is not famine, not earthquakes, not microbes, not cancer, but man himself who is man's greatest threat." Carl Gustav Jung. That statement alone demands deep contemplation. Jung wasn't being poetic. He understood that when the human mind descends into collective imbalance, the destruction can rival or surpass the worst natural disasters. A notorious example of mass psychosis can be found in the witch hunts that swept across Europe and the Americas between the 15th and 17th centuries. Thousands, mostly women, were persecuted, tortured, and executed, not for actual crimes, but due to a widespread paranoia fueled by fear and ignorance. Another chilling instance lies in the rise of totalitarian regimes during the 20th century. Delusional ideologies were accepted by entire nations as unquestionable truths, and anyone who dared to disagree was branded an enemy of the state, a traitor, or a lunatic. Mass psychosis corrupts morality, erodes critical thinking, and reduces conscious individuals to emotion-driven crowds. But what causes people to be swept up by such irrational forces? What triggers this mass disconnection from reality? That's the question we now turn to. Psychological causes behind the collapse. Mass psychosis does not emerge by accident. It stems from a specific combination of psychological, emotional, and social conditions that, when present together, act as a potent trigger. And it all begins with fear. Fear is a natural and legitimate emotion, and in many cases, a protective one. But when fear spirals into uncontrollable panic, it distorts our grasp on reality. In a panicked state, the brain shifts into survival mode, replacing logical thinking with instinctive, emotional responses. This psychological breakdown has been extensively analyzed by experts such as Silvano Arietti, one of the foremost authorities on schizophrenia in the 20th century. Arietti outlined that mental deterioration unfolds in predictable stages. The first stage is the panic phase, During this stage, individuals begin to experience the world as alien, dangerous, and chaotic. They feel disoriented, vulnerable, and incapable of making sense of what's happening around them. According to Arendt, the second phase is what he termed psychotic insight. At this point, the person constructs a new narrative to interpret their surroundings. But this narrative is rooted in delusion. They believe they've figured things out, yet their conclusions are severed from objective reality. Psychotic insight brings relief. It gives meaning to the internal chaos, even if that meaning is entirely false. Silvano Arrietty. This psychological defense, while dysfunctional, makes emotional sense. When reality becomes too unbearable, the mind reconfigures the world to create an alternative version that eases the inner torment. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid confronting their own soul. Carl Gustav Jung now imagined this same psychological mechanism occurring not in a single person, but in thousands, even millions. When an entire population is subjected to intense emotional stress, whether from genuine, perceived, or manipulated threats, a collective mental breakdown can begin to spread. In such an environment, truth becomes irrelevant. People no longer seek facts, they seek emotional relief. And at this critical juncture, collective delusions are embraced as psychological escape routes, seemingly the only way to restore a sense of inner stability. This phenomenon is perilous, for it shuts down critical thinking and activates the most primal instincts: fear, aggression, the urge to dominate, the need to submit. And the longer this psychological state persists, the thinner the boundary becomes between reason and madness. Which brings us to a crucial question: what unfolds when this psychic disintegration is no longer an isolated event, but becomes the normalized condition of an entire society? When madness becomes the system, when mental collapse extends beyond individuals and begins to engulf an entire community, we are witnessing mass psychosis in full effect. At this point, irrationality is no longer just tolerated, it is championed, reinforced, and often embedded into official structures. What was once abnormal now becomes the standard. People don't just tolerate insane ideas, they start living by them. Laws, norms, punishments, and everyday behaviors begin to reflect widespread delusional beliefs, and any effort to question this newly established common sense is met with aggression or even violence. History offers no shortage of terrifying examples. During the witch hunts, entire societies were consumed by moral panic, so intense that thousands of innocent people were executed based on groundless accusations. Rationality was replaced with hysteria. Justice gave way to superstition. In the 20th century, the world watched as totalitarian regimes institutionalized madness on a national scale. Nazism, for instance, turned racial delusions and myths of superiority into state policy, spawning concentration camps, genocidal laws, and global war. Millions perished, and perhaps most disturbingly, a considerable segment of the population supported it, convinced they were on the right side of history. Carl Jung expressed deep concern over this kind of collective behavior. The crowd always possesses a mentality lower than that of the individual. Carl Gustav Jung. This is a crucial insight. The individual in isolation retains the capacity to reflect, question, and hesitate. But the crowd, gripped by emotional narratives and social pressure, loses its ability to reason. It behaves impulsively, emotionally, and often dangerously. Under the grip of mass psychosis, individuals regress both morally and spiritually. They grow more aggressive, more submissive, and increasingly detached from empathy. Crimes they would never commit alone are now executed in groups, with a shared sense of righteousness. This behavior can be explained by the phenomenon of de-individuation. Within a crowd, personal accountability dissolves, and when insanity defines what is normal, even the most horrific acts are seen as justified. Yet, there is something even more chilling. just as a person in psychosis does not realize they are mentally ill, a society caught in collective delusion also fails to recognize its dysfunction. It sees itself as rational, as heroic, as progressing. And this is the most dangerous turning point. When insanity becomes systematized, dissent is no longer seen as reasoned opposition. It becomes a threat to be eliminated. But how does such a delusional structure remain intact? How can millions remain trapped in a seemingly inescapable cycle? The answer takes us to the next and darkest stage in this descent. Menticide, the murder of the mind. For mass psychosis to persist and deepen, initial fear and chaos are not enough. There must be a continuous, calculated, and systematic dismantling of the population's ability to think independently. This deliberate mental assault has a name: Menticide, the murder of the mind. The term was introduced by psychiatrist Joost Meerloo in his groundbreaking work, The Rape of the Mind. Meerloo defined menticide as a form of mass brainwashing carried out by totalitarian governments or elite powers with the goal of seizing control over collective consciousness. Menticide is an organized system of psychological manipulation that destroys people's capacity for independent thought. Joost Meerloo. It all begins with the planting of fear. Populations are bombarded with dire warnings, threats, dark forecasts, and fear-laden narratives. This keeps society in a constant state of anxiety, gradually eroding emotional resilience. Meerloo noted that one especially effective tactic was the use of waves of terror. In this strategy, periods of heightened fear are followed by brief intervals of calm, just long enough for people to catch their breath, but not to recover. Then, a new wave of even greater panic is unleashed. Over time, individuals become emotionally drained. In this weakened state, they become far more susceptible to propaganda, narrative control, and dependence on authority figures. But fear isn't the only tool of menticide. Deliberate confusion plays a central role as well. Contradictory information is constantly disseminated, making it nearly impossible for people to know whom to trust or what's true. This chaos is intentional, designed to disarm the rational mind and make it vulnerable to those who control the prevailing narrative. Logic can be met with logic, but illogic defeats those who rely on reason. Joost Meerloo. This psychological disorientation breeds a desperate hunger for order, and it's precisely in that moment that authoritarian leaders step in with ready-made answers. They provide direction, a sense of purpose, and often an external enemy to blame. They offer exactly what the weary mind wants to hear. Carl Jung, meanwhile, warns us that the deepest threat lies not outside, but within the emptiness of the self. Where love reigns, there is no will to power, and where power is paramount, love is lacking. The craving for power is rooted in inner weakness. Carl Gustav Jung. In a society already crippled by anxiety, isolation, and spiritual emptiness, menticide delivers a seductive truth. It's one built on delusion, fear, and relentless propaganda. And once this mental system becomes entrenched, it evolves into something even more dangerous. Totalitarianism, the political face of psychosis. When menticide becomes embedded in the societal structure, the next phase emerges almost inevitably: totalitarianism. This form of governance is not merely about the concentration of power. It is the embodiment of collective psychosis, hardened into a political system in which delusion is institutionalized and enforced as the official version of reality. The modern phenomenon of centralized, absolute state power, accompanied by the destruction of individual human rights. Arthur Versluy. Under a totalitarian regime, society is sharply divided into two distinct camps: the rulers and the ruled. Yet both groups suffer profound psychological damage. Those in power are elevated to an almost divine status. They are portrayed as saviors, visionaries, enlightened leaders. But behind the illusion, they are still human, flawed and corrupted by unchecked authority, sustained by the worship of a population reduced to childlike dependence. the masses, in turn, become submissive and emotionally reliant. They not only tolerate control, they crave it. This disturbing symbiosis between tyranny and obedience is one of the most chilling hallmarks of totalitarian systems. Political philosopher Hannah Arendt, a leading thinker on totalitarianism, wrote, "Totalitarianism seeks to alter human nature itself by eliminating spontaneity, freedom, and the capacity to think." Hannah Arendt. In such a diseased world, spontaneity is seen as a threat. Creativity becomes subversive. Critical thinking is criminalized. Carl Jung analyzed this dynamic with striking clarity. To him, totalitarianism was a symptom of the individual's collapse under the pressure of the collective unconscious. Those who fail to confront their shadow will forever remain enslaved by it. Carl Gustav Jung. What Jung meant is this: when people refuse to face their internal contradictions, their fears, resentments, and insecurities, they externalize those shadows. They invent enemies, projecting their inner conflicts onto the outside world, and in doing so, submit willingly to systems that promise safety and order. The more a society evades individual responsibility, the more it surrenders to the control of figures who appear as protectors, but are in truth reflections of a larger psychic collapse. Totalitarianism, then, is not simply an external structure of oppression. It is a widespread mental condition, a legitimized social psychosis supported by laws, cultural norms, and relentless propaganda. And the longer people live under such a regime, the harder it becomes to separate delusion from truth, manipulation from reality, obedience from freedom. But is there a way out? Can one resist a system in which mind, morality, and identity have been so thoroughly distorted? The answer is yes. But that resistance must begin within the individual. And that is precisely what we'll explore next. How to resist mass psychosis. In the face of a system that manipulates minds, dismantles reason, and codifies delusion into law, resistance may appear futile. But not only is resistance possible, it is essential. And more importantly, it begins in the quietest of places, unseen by the machinery of control, within the mind of the individual. Carl Gustav Jung deeply believed in the power of the conscious individual. To him, the health of a civilization is rooted in the psychological stability of its people, not in its institutions. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens. Carl Gustav Jung. Resisting mass psychosis starts with that inward gaze. It's not merely about challenging external systems, but about confronting our internal weaknesses, fears, emotional voids, and our longing to belong, which make us vulnerable to manipulation. The first line of defense is mental resilience, learning to think critically, to question, to live with uncertainty and complexity, to be able to say, "I don't know, and that's why I need to find out for myself." Furthermore, spreading information is a powerful act of resistance. Mass psychosis thrives in silence, censorship, and ideological uniformity. By sharing facts, challenging dominant narratives, and encouraging open dialogue, we chip away at the mental fog that keeps people trapped. Psychiatrist Joost Meerloo proposed an unexpected but potent weapon: humor. He once stated, "We must learn to combat the demagogue with the weapon of ridicule. The tyrant himself is humorless, and when mocked, he begins to crumble." Joost Meerloo. Laughter punctures the false sanctity that upholds totalitarian regimes. It breaks the illusion of invincibility and reveals the so-called supreme leader as merely a fragile man propped up by propaganda. Another effective approach is the creation of what Czech dissident and former President Václav Havel called parallel structures. These are alternative spaces, physical or symbolic, where truth can survive outside the grasp of the official system. It might be a community, an independent media outlet, a study circle, or an artistic project. What are parallel structures if not places where a different life can be lived, aligned with truth. Václav Havel. Each of these efforts helps reclaim personal agency, the ability to say no when the world demands a yes. And when enough people refuse to participate in the madness, the entire framework of delusion begins to crack from within. Resistance, therefore, does not rely on charismatic leaders or armed uprisings. It begins with a quiet, personal decision, the choice to remain sane in a world gone mad. But for that decision to truly matter, it must evolve into a way of living. And that leads us to the final and most vital chapter, the rebellion of consciousness. At the peak of mass psychosis, when madness is normalized and truth is silenced, even the simplest act can become a revolutionary gesture, remaining sane. In times of widespread delusion, individual awareness becomes the highest form of resistance. The only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. Albert Camus. This rebellion doesn't begin with rallies or banners in the streets. It starts quietly, through personal choices made in solitude, often in front of the mirror. It demands courage, the strength to think independently, to resist the herd, to endure the loneliness that often comes with clarity in a world engulfed in hysteria. Psychiatrist Carl Jung, while studying times of deep social upheaval, emphasized that totalitarian systems gain power when individuals abandon their inner responsibility. The integrity of the individual is the foundation on which the fate of humanity rests. Carl Gustav Jung. This means that resisting totalitarianism is more than a political act. It's a vow to stay true to one's inner truth, to preserve the soul, to protect what remains untainted when the world is infected with madness. So how do we maintain that integrity? It begins with education, not just formal schooling, but self-education. The habit of asking questions, checking sources, and recognizing emotional manipulation. It involves learning to spot logical fallacies, to distinguish between facts and propaganda, between sound reasoning and emotional blackmail. But knowledge alone is not enough. We also need human connection. Totalitarian regimes thrive on isolation, dehumanization, and the breakdown of emotional bonds. When we're isolated, we become easier to control, more programmable. This was demonstrated by physiologist Ivan Pavlov, whose research revealed that conditioned reflexes are most effective in quiet, solitary environments. The same principle used to domesticate animals was later applied at scale to manipulate entire populations. That's why maintaining real empathetic relationships, built on affection and active listening, is a powerful form of resistance. It's through connection that we witness sanity, rediscover common sense, and realize we're not alone. Another crucial form of defense is protecting privacy and personal autonomy. In the digital era, where surveillance is constant and algorithms shape our thinking, safeguarding what is private becomes a shield against psychological control. Freedom of expression must also be fiercely defended. Even if we disagree with what is said, the right to speak must be upheld. When speech is censored, thought itself is suffocated, and madness finds fertile ground. It's also essential to understand that totalitarianism doesn't rise overnight. It creeps in slowly, making each new restriction seem like a logical step from the last. That's why we must stay vigilant and say no before it's too late. We must draw lines, challenge each new rule, and reject conformity disguised as protection. And finally, we must cherish art, culture, and spirituality. These dimensions lie beyond the system's rational control and reconnect us with what is eternal within the human spirit. Art inspires, culture unites, and spirituality fortifies the soul against collective deception. The rebellion of consciousness is quiet but immensely powerful. It doesn't aim to destroy, it seeks to heal. It doesn't need applause. It only asks for integrity. What's at stake isn't just a political structure or a historical phase. It's the human ability to remain sane, free, and whole in the face of forces that seek to divide and conquer us. Mass psychosis is real, but the cure starts within you. And now, after everything we've explored, one question still echoes. Will you surrender to collective madness, or become the beacon that keeps the flame of sanity alive? In other words, mass psychosis is not some abstract idea or distant theory. It is a real, creeping threat, one that begins in the fragile mind of individuals and ends in systems of control, submission, and widespread devastation. We live in an era where thinking for oneself is an act of bravery. Staying mentally clear amid hysteria is a daily exercise in resistance, and preserving empathy, critical thinking, and human connection has become a mission of utmost urgency. But the final question remains: will you allow yourself to be molded by external forces, or will you take responsibility for your own consciousness? Real change always begins with the individual. Carl Jung. If this video resonated with you, don't let it stop here. Share it with someone who needs to wake up. Leave a comment telling us what impacted you most. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to continue exploring ideas that open eyes and free the mind. And if you want to take this further, keep the conversation going beyond this space. Talk, question, resist. Because freedom begins in the mind, and sanity is the first step toward rebuilding a world worth living in.